Pleasure to be here with Mr. Li, but also with Professor Wang. I also want to pay a tribute to a dear colleague of mine, Hanscom Smith, who was our Consul General in Shanghai for several years and now is taking care of the China desk here at the United States State Department. Hanscom, stand up. Stand up. Great job. You know, this month we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the reestablishment by President Carter of diplomatic relations between the United States and China. And I think back then, and even when Christopher Cox's grandfather, President Nixon, first visited China in 1972, it would have been just so difficult to imagine how dramatically China has transformed itself into the modern China of today. The bicycle and the Hutong alleys that characterized China even 25 years ago, the alleyways and the bicycle paths that President H.W. Bush and George W. Bush traveled upon, all have given way to Audis, elevated freeways, and the world's biggest network of bullet trains, some 17,000 miles of high-speed rail built in just the last 10 years alone. That's a set of rails crisscrossing the United States, 6 sets of rail crisscrossing the United States. What was plots of swamp and agricultural land just 20 years ago is shimmering financial districts with some of the world's tallest skyscrapers and 80-story Grand Hyatts with lobbies on the 54th floor in Shanghai, Guangzhou, and so many other cities throughout China. In my very first visit to China in 1989, foreigners were allowed to shop only in government friendship stores and only for trinkets and souvenirs. And now tourists can find the most famous brands and expensive luxury goods in huge shopping malls everywhere. And it's really frequented by the local Chinese. We all know how the internet has fundamentally changed how we communicate with each other and do business. It's equally dramatic in China. 95% of the Chinese access the internet via their smartphones. And while the percentage of the population with a smartphone is less than it is in the United States, the percentage of those using a smartphone in China to conduct financial transactions is 3 times the rate that it is here in America. Alibaba, China's e-commerce company, handled more sales last year than eBay and Amazon combined. And it's estimated that in a few years, the size of China's online retail market will exceed that of today's U.S., Japanese, U.K., German, and French markets combined. And the internet and social media are rapidly changing the way the Chinese people get their news, and express their views. I think more than anything, China's society is changing beyond all recognition. At the heart of the most sweeping social and economic transformation the world has seen is the rise of a powerful new and largely urban middle class. And the pace of change is extraordinary. As recently as the year 2000, only 4% of Chinese urban households were middle class. Today, it's approaching 75%. And the upper middle class, which make up about 14% of urban households, is expected in 8 years to make up almost half the urban population. There are over 1 million millionaires in China, and the BBC reported last year that there are almost 600 billionaires in China, compared to only 65 7 years ago. Another phenomenon confronting China is urbanization. 20 years ago, a quarter of the population lived in urban areas. Today, it's a little over half. And in a few years, it will be 70%. Just in the next 10 years alone, some 300 million Chinese living in the rural areas are expected to move into the cities. That's almost the population of America in the next 10 years, moving into the cities of China. When President George H.W. Bush was our envoy to China in the 1970s, our two-way trade with each other was less than $100 million a year. And very few jobs in both countries depended on trade. But today, roughly $1.5 billion of goods and services flow between our two countries every single day. China is our largest export market outside of North America, with exports to China growing almost twice the rate to the rest of the world. And America is China's largest export market, in fact exceeding all of the exports to the EU countries combined. More than 700,000 American jobs depend on producing goods and services exported to China. More than 2.5 million jobs in America depend on two-way trade with China. So people in both countries are benefiting from this deepening economic integration. And while China's accession to the WTO dramatically increased U.S. exports, China has clearly benefited from open markets around the world, enabling it to become the world's second largest economy. And with the success and the wealth that they have amassed, Chinese companies and entrepreneurs have been going global and investing abroad, including here in America. Chinese firms in the U.S. employ some 140,000 Americans, and it's predicted to employ some 200,000 Americans by the year 2020. And those investments run the gamut of high-tech, shale gas, entertainment, manufacturing, food processing, and of course, real estate. I spoke earlier of the dramatic transformation of China, the exploding rise of the middle class and rapid urbanization. But that's only one side of two stark, contrasting Chinas. Close to 45 million Chinese still live on less than $1 per day, the poverty level set by China. And while we have those gleaming skyscrapers rising in cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, thousands of villages in the interior still lack access to electricity. Indeed, 47% of the population lives in the countryside, mostly in homes with the barest of necessities or amenities. Every time I go back to our family village, just a few miles from a city of about 3 million people in Guangdong, it's like stepping back into the 1800s. Going back into the home where my father and grandfather and ancestors were born, and my father's uncle still lives and takes care of that home. But up until recently, there was no running water in the home. They have an outhouse that serves the entire village, some several hundred yards outside the village. And they cook using wood kindling and maybe some coal briquettes or maybe a hot plate in the back of the house. We went back recently. They now have a rice cooker. And of course, refrigerators are only the size of what you would see in a hotel room or in a college dormitory, which is why there's so much spoilage of food in rural China. Where will China get all the electricity that it needs to provide even basic amenities and appliances that the people in the cities take for granted or that we take for granted here in America? So economic reform is critical to uniting these two vastly different worlds within its borders. And the Chinese leaders know that they must continue to modernize their society and restructure their economy to rebalance from a model based on unsustainable infrastructure investment and exports of low-cost, low-wage manufacturing to a model driven more by domestic consumption and higher-wage innovation. At every level of our engagement with China, the U.S. has made the case that China's own economic goals are best served by adopting international norms regarding rule of law, protection of intellectual property, free enterprise, open markets, and fair competition. China needs to relax restrictions on foreign investment and business activity within its borders and remove the special privileges enjoyed by state-owned enterprises so that they have to compete on a level playing field with both foreign and even Chinese private firms. Despite the unprecedented transformation of China, China has enormous needs and challenges, from feeding its people to curbing pollution to providing energy to a growing population to creating jobs to caring for an aging population. And American products and services are highly valued and in great demand in China and can help the Chinese people and the Chinese leaders achieve their dreams of a higher quality of life while also creating jobs here in America. And low-cost, high-quality Chinese goods means more disposable income in the pockets of Americans who can then spend that freed-up money on vacations, retirement, the college education of their children, or health care. It's against this backdrop of China's changing society and the growing interdependence between China and the United States that we find ourselves in a trade war. In a trade war, there are no winners, only losers. And the brunt is borne by workers and consumers on both sides. To be sure, America and its companies, along with other nations and other foreign firms, have real issues with China's industrial and economic policies. So many sectors of the Chinese economy are still off limits to foreign investment, whereas here in America there are virtually no sectors that are closed to Chinese or other foreign investment. And where investment is allowed in China, American and foreign investment often has to be less than 50%, and thus must be with a Chinese partner with whom the U.S. company or foreign company has to share technology. But in a scenario of dueling tariffs, American workers, American consumers suffer. Tariffs on Chinese goods will raise the price of the many inputs or components used by American manufacturers. That will either reduce their profits or force them to charge higher prices, thereby making their products less competitive against competitors, whether in America or overseas. And so much of what American consumers buy is made in China with few substitutes readily available. That means American consumers simply have to pay a higher price. American and other foreign governments have very deep and legitimate complaints about Chinese policies over market access and forced technology transfer. But let's just hope that the negotiations over the next 90 days can bring both sides back away from a damaging trade war and make real progress on the fundamental issues between our two nations. America wants a strong and prosperous China that plays a key role in world affairs and works with us to uphold the international rules-based order and to ensure peace and stability throughout the world. A strong China is critical in the fight against global terrorism and halting the proliferation of nuclear weapons in North Korea and elsewhere around the world. A prosperous China with a rising middle class means more demand for our high-quality, made-in-USA goods and services, and that means more jobs for Americans. And a strong U.S. economy is good for China, because the more Americans are working and have money in their pockets, the more they will purchase, and so much of what they purchase is made in China, which means jobs for the Chinese people. And a strong U.S.-China relationship is good for the entire world, because so many of the issues confronting our world, from climate change to finding cures for the most dreaded diseases, to fighting terrorism, to alleviating hunger, cannot be solved by the United States or China alone. The world is looking for leadership from both China and the United States joining together to address these very tough issues. And so I applaud the U.S.-China Policy Foundation for all that it's doing to promote more understanding and exchange between our two countries. Because, quite frankly, diplomacy first begins with people-to-people exchange. The more that people understand each other, visit each other's countries, learn each other's history and culture and the challenges facing each other, the more effective we can ultimately be in diplomacy. So I want to thank the U.S.-China Policy Foundation for all that it's been doing these last 23 years. Keep up the great work. Thank you very much.